Congressman Ron Paul, a congressman from Texas, who is now the chairman of the subcommittee on financial services. Ron, are you there?
I am here. Good to be with you.
Well, thanks for coming on my show, this time in your new role as chairman of this subcommittee. And first, let me start off by asking you, just I think it was yesterday they officially released the findings from this congressional panel that supposedly was convened to find out why we had a financial crisis and a housing bubble. And I say supposedly because it seems to me that all they've done is rubber stamp their preconceived conclusions. But what I want to ask you about, it seems like all the reports, even the Republican reports, minority report, everybody seems to be absolving the monetary policy. The only criticism of the Fed is that they put too much trust in free markets, that they didn't have enough oversight. But nobody is criticizing the low interest rates, the money printing. I mean, how can they not think the housing bubble was related to the cheap mortgages and the teaser rates and all this that made price appreciation possible?
They said if they only had more regulations, they could have saved us from all that mess. We had hearings this week on the full committee, and we had 3 former members of the Federal Reserve. And the one thing I proposed to them was, that everybody in the Congress is against all this unemployment. The subject was unemployment. I said, nobody wants this, but everybody has a different solution. But I still don't even think that's the argument. The argument is, why do we have it? How did it come about? Where did the recession come from? Where did the boom come from? And if you don't find out where the boom came from and why you had this necessary correction, you get your recession and depression. That's why you have unemployment. So the other thing that galls me on these committees and these investigations is how many Austrian economists do they ask? Did they call you and ask you for your opinion on why they had unemployment?
Well, not only that,
they go
Ron,
back to the guys who created the problem.
Not only did they not call me, I repeatedly reached out to them offering to testify, basically saying, look, I'm one of the only guys that publicly predicted all this. Don't you want to at least hear my take on it? And I tried to get in front of the committee. Maybe if you do any investigations, I'd love to be a witness, regarding the Federal Reserve.
They're not interested in the truth because it's a reflection of them. Do you think Bernanke could handle the truth? I think psychologically these guys get to the point where it's impossible for them to adjust because it would mean they'd have to throw 30 or 40 years of their arguments and all their work and all their dissertations out the window. They're not capable of doing that.
And I think, too, the reason that they don't want to criticize the cheap money policies under Greenspan is because they're even worse under Bernanke. And if they acknowledge that interest rates being too low helped inflate the housing bubble, then they have to question what problems are being created by current monetary policy, which is even looser.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make any sense that, if they spend too much, borrow too much, and print too much, cause a problem. How's that going to be the answer? But that's where they stand. And then, of course, they dumped on us, the Dodd-Frank stuff, and that was part of the problem in the Depression. They kept loading up on more regulation. Every time we have a problem, they load up on more regulation. Sarbanes-Oxley was put in to stop all this stuff, but, that just made our economic problems worse.
Yeah, well, do you have any increased power? I mean, now that you're chairing this subcommittee, is there something that you can do now that you couldn't do before that might advance, our cause?
A little bit. I look at it in the form of influence. I think our message is making some inroads even in the Congress. I think it's more credible, and they're admitting that I had been saying this for 20, 25 years. And it's only now they're starting to pay attention. The fact that they even allowed me to become chairman of this domestic monetary policy subcommittee is a major step. This is a totally unknown committee. Nobody's ever done a thing on it. Nobody's ever investigated monetary policy, and they know I'm going to do that. But it's going to be more for exposure. I don't have power. Matter of fact, they explained to me that I can't even subpoena Bernanke or the Secretary of the Treasury. Only a full committee can do that, and they're not going to. But I can still, which is stronger than any of those kind of political powers, and it is the power of the correct ideas. And we do have a forum. I've had a platform as a member of Congress, but the platform is bigger now, and I do want to have some serious discussions and make sure that those things we just got done talking about gets more exposure.
Are you going to have any say? I know there was just a recommendation from the SEC, and it hits very close to home for me because it's my industry, regarding requiring the brokers to uphold the fiduciary standard, the same standard that we have for registered investment advisors. Is that going to find its way into your subcommittee at all, or?
No, it wouldn't be my subcommittee. That'd be others. So I would think that if they were talking about fiduciary responsibility, I wonder what would happen if we applied that to those who are responsible for our trust funds in government, Social Security, and Medicare. And
the problem.
They're going to regulate you, and they can't even come close to regulating themselves.
Oh, yeah. Well, the big problem I mentioned on this show that I have with this, obviously I always do what's in my client's best interest. I don't need the government to tell me to do that. But what happens is when they impose this fiduciary responsibility, the government or the regulators determine what's in the client's best interest. So they could determine that, recommending precious metals, recommending foreign government bonds, that's not in the client's best interest. After all, the best thing is U.S. Treasuries. And so if you veer from the course of what the regulators define as what is in people's best interest, and you recommend something other than that, then potentially you could have a lot of problems, which I think is...
the regulators are interested in protecting their interests, which are the government's interests, and they contradict what the people's interests are, and therefore, they have the clout, and they have the power of legislation and taxation. So that's where the real problem is, and that's why, of course, the marketplace is so much better, because people keep saying, well, the market, if you have a free market, there's totally no regulation, but there's regulation. If you don't serve your customers right, you're going to be regulated out of business, and that's the kind of regulation we want. So it's always, I think, not correct when they keep saying that, we just don't want anything. Well, we don't want people stealing from us. We don't want people defrauding from us. We should have a government that doesn't defraud us with fiat currency. That's where the fraud.
Well, speaking
really
about
is.
Fraud, I've read now that there is some senators that are going to potentially filibuster this increase in the debt ceiling. Do you know if Rand is going to take part in that filibuster?
I don't know absolutely. Obviously, I know he'd be sympathetic. Filibusters don't work very well if you don't have more than a couple people.
I know we got to
get. They can close you down anytime you want. You have to have more than 40 people willing.
The thing
to do
that I
it.
think, though, I mentioned earlier in the show, and we get your take on it, is they're saying, well, if we get if the Senate will pass a balanced budget amendment, that maybe they'll do it. But my problem with that is, even if they pass it, and even if the House passes it with 2/3, you got to wait for 3/4 of the states to ratify it. That could take years. We don't have years. We need to do something now.
It's good that it calls attention to it, but and I'd probably vote for it, but I'm not a champion of that. Besides, if there's no way they can prevent taxes from going up. If you mandate a balanced budget, then they say, well, we can't do this, and we have to do it, so we have to raise taxes. So that's a real problem.
Well, the problem
is, anyway, it's symbolically emphasizing the disaster of our spending and our deficits, but it's not the solution, like you say. It takes too long.
Well, and also the problem is, they just can't raise taxes because you don't know what your revenues are going to be. You can raise taxes, and the taxes could so depress the economy and alter behavior that you end up with lower revenue. And so ultimately it has to be achieved through reductions in spending.
Yeah, and my argument also is, let's say you did get the constitutional amendment passed. Is there any parts of the Constitution now that is that are followed closely?
No, they ignore the whole thing.
Of it. So why wouldn't they ignore this? And then they could get the Fed to spend the money for them. If we don't spend it, the Fed will spend it and do the bailing out, and we won't even have to authorize.
Yeah.
And we don't even have to put it on the debt. The thing is so out of control.
We got to break for commercial. We'll be right back with more of this interview after this. Congressman Ron Paul. Congressman, there are plenty of rumors that are floating around regarding your, political aspirations for 2012. Some people are talking about a presidential bid again. Some people are talking about a Senate run. In fact, your son was even asked about that recently on CNN. I've got the clip here. Why don't you play that answer? It's clip number 5.
On the first day of this Congress, I was with you up on that very balcony with your dad. He, of course, is a House member, conservative from Texas. You're a senator, Republican from Kentucky. In the Dallas Morning News this morning, there is an article quoting your father, Ron Paul, saying he's thinking about running for the Senate seat that is on the ballot in Texas in 2012. Have you talked about that? Do you think that's likely?
Well, the thing about it is we have talked about the House and the Senate. You know, if he comes over, I would actually have seniority on him. So then he would have to listen more to my arguments. And so far, he has some pretty strong opinions of his own. So we'll see. I don't know what his decision is, but I think he is thinking about it. But I don't know really what his thoughts, conclusions are.
So are you ready to be a junior senator to Rand?
He's needling me. I better rethink even this whole thing. Now, I really hadn't thought much about it, but they did a poll, and I came in very close to the top, and so that surprised me a little bit. And a lot of the supporters here in Texas have urged me to, consider it. But that's the very most I can say is, yeah, I'm considering it because of that poll and because people ask me. But I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, how serious I am about considering it, I would say it's pretty much in the middle. It's not real serious, but I haven't been able to say absolutely not. I'm not even going to consider that. I haven't said that, nor have I
know
said
you ran. Wasn't it when John Tower resigned? Didn't you?
Yeah, when he resigned back in the 80s, and that was that didn't go too well.
Now, I forget what the rules are. Can you run for Congress and Senate at the same time?
Not in Texas. If there's a special election, let's say there was an election this year because somebody resigned, and you're in office, you don't have to resign from your office. But if you can't have your name on the ballot in two places unless you're running for president. So last go-around, I was running for my congressional seat as well as for president. You're allowed to do that, and they call that the LBJ law because LBJ was running for vice president, back in the 60s. And he also wanted to cover himself and run for his Senate seat, so he wasn't sure they were going to win. So he ran, and they changed the law in Texas. So that's the only time you can have your name on the ballot twice.
Oh, all right. So I always thought that to me it doesn't even make sense that if you hold one office, you shouldn't even be allowed to seek an alternative office without resigning. Because a lot of times you get, the senator running for president or governor running for president. If you were elected to be a governor and you're spending all your time running for president, who's governing the state?
So you're arguing the case that Sarah Palin did the right thing. She resigned because she wanted to go out and do some politicking, and she didn't want to pretend that she was still the governor. Anyway, just bring it up.
Yeah, while we're on the subject of Rand and him needling you, I'll give you a chance to maybe return the needle if you have, because I like Rand a lot. I'm a big supporter, but he said something on CNBC the other day that bothered me, and I'll see if bothers you. He said that we can solve the Social Security problem, solve it. And all we have to do is gradually raise the retirement age to 70 over the next 35 years. And if we do that little tiny thing, we're going to solve the Social Security problem. I mean, do you think that would solve the problem?
No, I don't think anybody could absolutely answer that. It might help it a whole lot. That would cut out a lot of cash outlays, over that period of time. But one thing they don't know, and why all these numbers never pan out, is that nobody knows what the employment rate is going to be and how much income there's going to be, and that's how they base their income on Social Security. The population is getting smaller, the jobs are less, the jobs aren't paying as much, and if unemployment, stays up or continues to increase, which I think it may well, then those revenues are unpredictable. So I think it's unpredictable, but if somebody wants to tinker around the edges and think they're solving problems, I can see that a benefit, but I don't think anybody can be absolute on what the results would be.
I mean, I think we need a higher retirement age, but we need it now, immediately, not phased in over 35 years, and not to exempt all the people that are currently on it. And, of course, it doesn't solve the problem because a Ponzi scheme doesn't become viable if you tinker with the terms. There is no way to solve an unsolvable problem because a system based on Ponzi financing does not work, which is why it's illegal.
That's why my position on the campaign 2 years ago was, especially when I talked to the college kids, I'd just say, it's insolvent. Why do you have to pay into if you want out? If I had anything to say about it, I'd let you just get out. You take your money and take care of yourself. And most
the
of them
problem
are
is
very receptive to that.
Well, the problem is, you can suffer from a terminal disease, and you still have to pay the Social Security taxes, even if it's obvious that you're not going to live long enough to collect it. I think I remember at some point there were some AIDS patients years ago that were trying to get out of the Social Security tax because they weren't going to live long enough to collect it, but they weren't able to do it. They said, "Well, I need the money. I could use it for medicine. Why are you taking it away from me for my old age when I'm not going to make it into my old age?" And it shows that it's not really a retirement plan. It's a tax to fund the current beneficiaries. It's got nothing to do with...
If it was a real fund, you could pick your beneficiaries and the money would be there. And, that would remove all this big debate about beneficiaries, whether they're married or not married, and the definition of marriage. You just write down who your beneficiary is, and if you die young, that member of the family or whoever you name as your beneficiary would get the money, and that would solve that. But that would work in the market, but not in the government, because the money is not there, and they're not funding. And this whole thing, I think, people have to realize it is a transfer payment. It is a welfare system, even though we'd like to pretend, and even I have legislation in that would work in the direction of the pretense that it would be a trust fund by saying you can't spend any of the money. You got to put it in negotiable treasury bills or assets. But
they should
not
have
going to do that.
Well, they should have to invest it not in our assets. They should have to buy, Swiss assets, or European, or Japanese, or Chinese, or Canadian. They can't just lend the money to themselves.
Well, but we end up doing that too. We were buying up everything, but most of them are worthless when we buy up all the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac derivatives. That's what we're investing in, unfortunately.
Well, that doesn't count. But anyway, so if running for the Senate is a long shot, what about the White House again? I mean, where do you stand now about having another run at it like you did in 2008?
I'm still pretty undecided on that. I'm pretty ambivalent, and I give about the same answer. I'm actually so engaged right now in doing the job on oversight of the Federal Reserve that for me to be traveling a lot, I haven't been able to quite, adapt to that. But I don't have to decide right now. I'm going to wait a few months. It's interesting that some of the other candidates are doing the same thing. Even Huckabee and Romney are saying, well, I might not decide till summertime. So that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world.
Is there anyone?
I don't have to answer right now, so I have time to think about it. And things change so quickly. So events may be such that I think it's worthwhile. And right now, I don't feel pressure that I have to say that I am not or that I am doing it. So I'm going to wait a few more months.
Yeah. Do you see any other candidates out there, assuming you choose not to run? Is there anyone else out there right now that maybe is potentially throwing a hat in the ring that you think that you would support?
Well, I haven't studied them enough. I'd have to wait and see who files.
Yeah, but you'll definitely be sticking around for another term in the House if you decide to stay out of the Senate and the presidency.
Yeah, that's my plan.
Yeah. Well, are you the most senior member of your subcommittee? I mean, because I think you've been there a long time now. Is that?
Yeah, I've been passed over, I think, 3 other times just for political reasons, and I don't conform to what they want in chairmanships. But so even though it was a long wait, it's still pretty amazing that they've allowed me to do it. But I think it's the sentiments that changes. I mean, I ended up getting every Republican to support the Fed bill, so people are anxious to know more about the Fed. So I think events have changed, the crisis has changed, and people's understanding and interest in the Fed have changed. So times have caught up with the politicians and the leadership in the House.
And I certainly think the Fed is a big part of the Tea Party, and I think you had a lot to do with bringing the Fed into that discussion.
That helped. That certainly has helped.